Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming to IU's 14th Lunch Talk. As you know, the Independent Evaluation Unit hosts monthly lunch talks as part of its overall objective to create a culture around learning and evaluation and evidence. As part of this, we bring in experts from around the world that work in leadership positions on and a high expertise position on climate change, on evaluation, on development, and areas that are methodologically important and rigorous for us that we might, so that the IU and really the overall DEF might stay at the frontier of practice and theory. We have featured heads of organizations in the past, and for today's talk, I'm really privileged and honored to have one of our colleagues, Dr. Asfaw, who is going to be talking about policy options to manage climate risk and food insecurity. Solomon is a principal evaluation officer working at the Independent Evaluation Unit, and from my perspective is part of this overall larger global community of leaders and experts on this area. And we're really privileged to have him talking to us today about some of the work that he's been doing previously and currently continues to do on thinking about adaptation options, on livelihood options, and how risk in the context of climate change can be mitigated. Previously, Solomon has worked at the Food and Agriculture Organization and has also worked at ICRISAT as a regional scientist. At the IU, Solomon works on impact evaluation, data, and advisory services. And Solomon has a PhD from Germany. As part of our overall engagement with everyone, not just within GCF, but across similar sounding organizations as well as similarly thinking organizations, I'm going to also encourage all of you to give us thoughts about people that we can and should be inviting that can help us to take us out of our own comfort zones and to think in new and different ways. For next month, our next IU talk will feature Dr. Yuha Wito, who is the head of evaluation at the Global Environment Facility, and that talk will be on the 30th of November. We'll also have another talk potentially at the middle of December, but we'll announce that later. For today, the format of the talk will run as follows. Solomon will present for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And hopefully a very healthy and active discussion by all of you. Sorry, I should have introduced myself. I'm Joe, and I work with the Independent Evaluation Unit. With that, Solomon, over.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe, for that kind introduction. And I would like to thank you also for coming to the talk. So today I will be talking on some of the work I've done in my previous job and also some of the insight that I got from a book I co-edited also while I was working at related to climate risk management. So I try to not to be too technical, try to focus on the top line narrative or story that came from much more rigorous research to give you kind of a flavor of what I'm talking about. So I'll try to follow the outline. I'll try to give you a flavor about why risk matters generally for smallholders or small landholders in developing countries, and try to focus on two case studies, one dealing with cash transfer programs in sub-Saharan African countries, which are being involved in those programs, and also discuss some of the emerging evidence on weather index insurance, how weather index insurance have been used in selected countries to manage risk associated with climate, and finally give you a short conclusion. Generally, when we think about risk, we could think about different kind of risk that farmers, landholders, smallholders face across developing countries, what we call production risk that are associated with climate, pest, and diseases. And there are also price risks, more global, regional, local price volatility, and what we call also idiosyncratic risks that are associated with households, and so on and so on. So the key what will happen, the risk is basically it will affect their revenue in terms of their income and stability, and then that would have an effect on investment in food production or investment in non-food production. So the fundamental thing is affecting the instability of income for households, which has an implication for their livelihood. So generally, in developing countries, there's a number of ways they manage risk. One way is basically to mitigating risk by investing in activities that reduce the likelihood of adverse events, like investment in irrigation schemes, use of resistance, improved early warning system. And another way is also to transfer the risks to a third party by using insurance, like commercial insurance or hedging strategy. And another option could be by coping to those risks, right? You want to use social safety net programs such as cash transfers and other forms, or buffer funds and saving and strategic funds and so on. I could imagine like some of the investment like BMA, like JD work on, could deal on some of these issues in terms of dealing with climate risk at the family, at the household level. In one way or another, they are linked in terms of reducing the risk. So basically today, I would like to focus on two of those instruments, cash transfer program in sub-Saharan African countries and weather index insurance. So generally, when you talk about cash transfer programs in sub-Saharan African country, over the last decade or so, there is an expansion of this program in a number of African countries. Approximately half of the countries, sub-Saharan African, have some sort of government-run cash program, and there are also other cash transfer programs run by NGOs or multilateral agencies. And some of these programs are national, and some are at the pilot level. And the key information is that most of beneficiaries of these programs are rural-based, and they are mostly engaged in agriculture. So I like, and when we talk about cash transfer, basically we talk a lot about cash transfer program in Latin American countries, and there's some peculiar feature about this program in African countries. One is that most of these beneficiaries are very live in high risk and vulnerability. Household associated with HIV/AIDS, the poverty is much more endemic, and there's a very heavy reliance on agriculture and informal economy. And normally the exit out of poverty is not through labor market situation. So the markets let's develop and they are associated with risk. That's one of the peculiar features in African context. The second one is associated with institutions. When we compare African countries with respect to Latin American, there are weaker fiscal space, with the exception of Southern Africans like South Africa, Namibia, Botswana. The fiscal space is very low, so the donors play heavy on those things. And in terms of consensus at the national level on the merit of these programs, there are not consensus, and there is a weak supply of service and so on. Generally, these two kind of features differentiate from the Latin American context. So the question as an economist we think about is, why do we expect cash transfer programs to have a productive or resilience impact to manage risk, right? So these are involved around what we call the market failure, just around that. If there is no market failure, that means that there is enough credit for households or the credit markets functioning very well. If you inject the cash into an household and economy, one may not expect an impact. But that is not the case in most of many African countries. So one way cash transfer program can have a productive impact is that families could use the cash to invest in their kids to send to school, or use the money for health service, which can have impact on human capital development. That's one element. And the second element is also that, as we call the cash transfer, could relax the constraint in terms of liquidity, and families could use some of the money to buy inputs, assets, and so on, what we call productive activities. So that could be another way through which cash transfer can have a productive or then build the resilience. Another way that also that they will help families to avoid what we call detrimental risk coping strategies. So they will not withdraw their kids from school, they will not reduce their consumption or other risk-averse strategies. So through that, they would help to manage shocks and risk, and that's one way a cash transfer could help. And the fourth one is also it would help in terms of managing or building social network, right? Network is another way households manage risk generally by sharing incomes, foods, and so on. And cash transfer could relax the burden on the network within the family. And then finally, what we call also, they could build a local economy. When we inject, I'll talk briefly later, when we inject a certain amount of cash into a local village, it will have what we call a multiplier effect within the local economy. So these are some of the ways, from theory point of view, how cash transfer could affect productivity, activities, resilience, and livelihood generally food security within the country. But in empirics, generally, when we talk about, from empirical point of view, this might not be the case. So that's why I tried to talk today from an empirical point of view, whether cash transfer program in these countries would have a productive impact, whether cash transfer could help in terms of mitigating effects of weather shocks, and whether it would generate a local economy impact. So what we did while I was working at in the past 5-6 years, we did conduct impact evaluation in about 6 countries, and most of the designs of these programs are what we call experimental design, social experiment, when we randomly assign this program to a treatment group and control groups, and some of them are we call a quasi-experimental design. Basically, we are advocating this kind of program, and our IEU LORTA program, generally, that could apply to a GCF project. Yeah. I don't go into the detail of this one, but generally, this looks like the design of the evaluation. So we followed a mixed method approach. These programs, we have not done this impact evaluation for the sake of research, but it is a real-world evaluation of government-run cash transfer program. And so we use a quantitative and a qualitative methods, what we call experimental and econometric methods, and also in terms of understanding the perception of the beneficiaries, understanding the social network, the dynamics in the local community. We also pursued a qualitative data collection, and also we applied what we call this local economy-wide impact evaluation. That's to understand the multiplier effect of this injection of additional cash into the local economy. So we collected data at baseline, and we collected data at follow-up, and from what we call this treatment village and a control village. That's very important. This is what we call a counterfactual. Those villages who are not receiving the program, and then we compare this control with the treatment. Saying this much about the design and the data. So what are like the key story that emerged from those results? So the first thing that I try to make the point is that there's a big debate in Africa, also in many countries, that cash transfer is like a charity. You better use the money for another investment. Those beneficiaries are like kind of beggars, destitute, and so on. I think what we find from most African countries are to the contrary. Most of these farmers produce crop, they have livestock, they are engaged in some sort of, although they use low technology, but they have some assets, some of them engage in non-farm enterprise. The point is that for this family livelihood does matter. So that's the reason why one could imagine to expect a productive impact from this beneficiary. So we use a number of proxies to use whether households who are receiving this cash transfer program would have a better in terms of use of motor inputs. If they use some of the cash to invest in some assets, and then that translates into increase in productivity and market surplus, and so on and so on. So these are some of the productivity indicators we used. And this plus means a positive impact, and minus means a negative impact, and this means not significant in a statistical or an econometric study. So the story is that for Zambia and Malawi, we did observe it much more a stronger impact of the program on this proxy we used to measure productive activities. In Kenya and Lesotho, it's kind of a mixed story. There is no conclusive story. But then in Ghana, we have got lesser impact. So you would observe much more heterogeneous impact of cash transfer program on indicators of productivity. I'll come and talk later about what could explain some of this heterogeneity across country. But the key narrative is that there is an evidence that this cash transfer program could translate into increase in some of the indicator of productive activity. The second story that came out of in terms of the ability of households to manage risk. That means whether households have been reducing negative coping strategy, whether they have been paying their debts, borrowing less, and so on and so on. And the story that came out across the country when you look at in a nutshell, and the bigger story without looking into the detail, is that there is a reduction in negative coping strategy, there is increase in saving, paying off debts, and some sort of like risk aversion kind of strategy in terms of reducing that. And the second key message for some of the selected countries also, there's some evidence of kind of strengthening the social network within the community, that there would be less burden in the network in terms of helping one another because there's additional support through this program. I think this is a very key story that came out of that evaluation. And the third key story I like to talk is also about whether cash transfer program can help in terms of mitigating the adverse effect of climate shock. This is a paper I did on Zambia cash transfer program, and we use the Zambia data and we merged those data with historical rainfall data that we got from a satellite GIS data. So we created an indicator that measures rainfall shock. That's a negative rainfall shock, the standard precipitation index. That kind of signal kind of a drought. And then we interacted these two for those of you who knows econometrics, and that's the story that tell us that. So there is an evidence that those households who have been benefiting from the program could mitigate the adverse effects of the weather shock they experienced. I don't go into the detail, but that's a key message that comes from that study. And another key story that we got is also this is we did what we call a quantile treatment effect estimator to understand how the impact kind of varies across the distribution of income in a household. That means whether the impact is stronger within the poor segment of the population versus the richer. So again, the key message that came out of it that the mitigating effect of those cash transfer program is stronger for the poorest segment of population. So there's some element of this pro-poor nature of this program, at least for the case of Zambia. But I have to admit that most of this cash transfer program, either in Africa or Latin America, they are not designed with climate change in mind. Mostly these are livelihood, mostly these are poverty. And I try to kind of tease out the element of this program for climate change adaptation, and there is a potential to that. But again, one need to think also at the design level. And lastly, with respect to cash transfer, I'd like to talk also about impact beyond beneficial, what we call this spillover effect, right? So what I've been talking now so far is that those who are benefiting from the program, the impact on that. But one could consider also impact beyond beneficiaries. And this in economics also we talk about the non-tradable kind of theory that when you provide cash transfer to household, they will give the cash and they start to spend the money within the local economy, right? So the money leaves the house, and then it will create through market and interaction and exchange, and then the money will leave the village to the neighboring village, and what we call this general equilibrium when the program scale up. But in this case, we did estimated what a local economic impact for those programs. So generally, there could be three possible scenarios when we provide cash into a local economy. What we call if the supply response within that community would be elastic, if the farmers stand to expand their production, their service, one could expect much more stronger local multiplier. But if everything comes from outside, that means everything comes from outside, the household will spend the money buying goods and services that come from outside the village, one might not expect a local multiplier. But the challenging would be if the supply response is inelastic or they don't expand their production. This is what we call inflation. That's one the critic of cash transfer, right? It would create inflation, right, to increase the price of goods and services. So it all depends on the three. So we did, in collaboration at the time with the University of Davis, did this local multiplier effect. And in most of the country, what we find is a multiplier effect that's greater than 1. That means if you provide $1 or $1, for instance, in Ethiopia case, the multiplier effect is greater than 1. 1.5 to additional, it will say, for the non-beneficiaries. And in the case of Ghana, in the case of Kenya, it's much more smaller, but in most of the countries we look, the multiplier effect is greater than 1, right? So, but if there is a constraint, if the households would not expand their production, their services, and so on, the multiplier effect might be less. But the story is that there is an evidence that the cash transfer program within these countries could have a local multiplier effect. And one could also frame this in terms of that translating into building a local resilience, right? I mean, resilience is a very broader concept. I don't want to use it loosely, but these are some of the elements what constitutes a bigger resilience, either at the household level or broader at the local county level. So the question is then, what does explain this heterogeneity across the country? I think that's very important thing with it, right? So we observed it much more stronger impact for Zambia, but then in Ghana the impact is much more smaller across different indicators we used, right? So we try to understand that in a cross-country kind of comparison way, and some of the key measure we find is also that predictability of the payment didn't matter in most of the country. What we observed in Ghana, the way the program was implemented was that it was not predictable, right? In Ghana, they got sometimes higher amounts, sometimes no, and so on. While in Zambia, there is very uniform kind of payments throughout the life process. So lumpier and regular in case of Ghana, and then regular and predictable. So for families, households, it matters whether a given cash is provided to them in a predictable manner so that they can plan how to invest, where to invest, and how to use their cash, right? So that's one of the key messages from implementation point of view. The second point we find is also in that the transfer size matter, right? It's not only enough to have a program in a country, but how much are the families are receiving, right? So these are like the amount of the transfer in terms of the percentage of per capita income for the different program we observed. So for those countries where the transfer size is bigger, we didn't observe a widespread impact. For those countries where the transfer size is smaller, the lesser impact. So we kind of look at the rule of thumb. What would be the size of the transfer in a country? And we came like, it needs to be a minimum 20% of their per capita income, the cash transfer that would be given to the households. So that's another key message that came from this cross-country. And the third key message we find is also the targeting matters, right? The demographic profile of those households who are benefiting from the country. With the case of Ghana program, most of the beneficiaries are households with elderly or with children, so there is not that much male able-bodied household members within the country. It matters in terms of how they use the money and translate into productivity. So of course, if the cash transfer program objective is social objectives in terms of helping the vulnerable groups, then it's okay. But if there is a productive element, then one could consider also how to target and to whom to target. So generally, the key message on cash transfer program is that there is overall positive effects of cash transfer on welfare, and there is also the mitigating role of extreme weather shocks, and also the effect is much more stronger in the lower quantile of the distribution for the poorest, and there is also a multiplier effect, and the impact varies because of the transfer size, predictability, and demographic profile. So saying this much about cash transfer, I'll use maybe 5-10 minutes of time to talk briefly on weather index insurance, how weather index insurance could help. This is again based on some of the finding that was done, contributed in a book chapter. So I'm borrowing some of the finding from others with it. But I thought it would be very useful for GCF and for us to think about that. Generally, when we talk about weather index insurance in developed countries, it's a very common and widespread thing. Most of the programs are compulsory and very highly subsidized, right? So the way they pay the weather index, the insurance is that the insurer, they visit the farm and they check the loss and they'll pay the payment, right? But that may not be conducive for most small-scale producers in developing countries because there's a large number of small landholders, which would increase the administrative cost of dealing with them. So it would be very expensive to use the commercial insurance. And also the regulatory environment within these countries are pretty weak, right, to enforce those insurance contracts, right? So the commercial insurance is basically ill-suited for most small-scale environments in developing countries. That's the reason why the weather index insurance was considered as one of the innovative instrument or option to deal with small landholders, right? So most of the payout for smallholders are based on what they observe, the rainfall, right? So there's no need to visit the farm to verify the loss. And in theory, some of the advantage for weather index insurance is that the lengthy claim process would be reduced dramatically, and there is no issue with moral hazard. What does that mean? That means that there is no incentive for households to behave in a certain way to claim the payouts, because the payouts is dependent on rainfall, not on the way they behave. And also, there's the limited problem of adverse selection in the case of weather index insurance. So it's not dependent on the characteristics of the individuals. Unlike the case, for instance, for health insurance, right? The sick people would like to get enrolled into health insurance, while the healthy would like to opt out. That means it depends on the personal characteristics of the household. In the weather index insurance, there's little of that. But the problem is what we call a basis risk in the weather index insurance. What that means, the weather index insurance will only partially cover the insurance. I'll discuss about what this basis risk implies, right? Farmers also deal with many other risks other than the rainfall. So generally, the way, just to give an idea about how the payout schedule looks like in a stylized weather index insurance, is that normally it depends on the deficit of the land. If this rain and this represent the deficit or the shortfall of the land. So normally, until a certain threshold, the payout increase conditional on the deficit of the rainfall, right? They will pay. But at a certain threshold, there will be a maximum payout. That means at this threshold of rainfall deficits, they assume that there will be a total crop failure or a drought, and then there will be a maximum payout. So as you can imagine, such kind of payout scheme, this is not dependent on farmers' characteristics. There is no issue of moral hazard. Farmers cannot cheat, cannot behave in a certain way to get the payouts. And in theory, it seems like a very good one. But as I noted, the major issue with the weather index insurance is the base risk. Let me give you kind of in a concrete way, right? So there are two farms, farm 1 and farm 2, located at different locations, and there is a weather station here that collects rainfall, right? So these two farms have the insurance product, they bought the weather insurance product, and the way they will receive the payout is conditional on the rainfall that is collected on this weather station. Rainfall can be idiosyncratic across two policyholders, and this because, as you can imagine, within a given district, a given region, it could rain in one place and it may not rain in another place. So if the rain, for instance, comes here and doesn't come here, so the insurer may not pay a payout for this household because the weather station kind of indicates that there's no problem with the rainfall. That's kind of what we call a basis risk, right? So to address this one, you need to have a weather station kind of very widely spread across the different regions, which, as you can imagine, will be one of the challenge. Even if we have a weather station collecting rainfall here, there might be other non-weather factors that affect the crop loss, right? Disease, pest, and so on. And this weather index insurance will not cover for such kind of loss. That's what we call a base risk. So generally, to understand it, there is a lot of experimentation of weather index insurance that was conducted by many academic institutions in Ethiopia, and Ghana, and India, and Malawi. They try to understand, how weather index insurance would work in different crops, under different conditions that triggers the payouts, whether the effect of discount across different discount scenario, different encouragement, and also they try to understand the demand of the product and if there is an impact on production decision and so on and so on. And there are also other index instruments that are related to livestock, but I'll try to kind of give you some of the key findings that came out of this 4-country study that was conducted, primarily, I think, by Jepal and the colleagues there who worked on those areas. So I think one of the key stories that came out of that story is about demand of weather index insurance, right? Generally, the demand was low at the market price, but when there is a discount, the demand primarily increased. This is the research that was done in Ghana and 3 regions in India, and they tried to provide a discount on weather index insurance and to get enough data to plot a demand curve. This is a demand curve. This is a percentage of market price, and this is the take-up of those products. Yeah. And those are the authors that did. I mean, the key message that came out of this kind of this study is that at the market price, the demand is about from 6 to 18%. Right? If weather index insurance is sold at the normal market price, we have a take-up rate of about 6 to 18%, which is quite very low for a commercial viable weather index insurance. In India, for instance, the take-up is about 60%, but then they have to provide at the market price of 25%. That means they have 75% discount. So that's the question. So can weather index insurance be viable without a subsidy generally? So the low demand is one of the key issues with the weather index insurance, but they also try to understand, okay, though there is low demand, either what is the impact of this weather index insurance for those families or households who purchase the product, right? And there are some good stories that, for instance, in India, families trying to invest on cash crop, they tend to use much more high fertilizer, and there is a shift to high yielding variety. And the story that there is farmers tend to take more risk with the index insurance. But the question still remains the low demand of the weather index insurance. So the question is that possible to increase the demand of weather index insurance in a viable way? And they try to do also some study by promoting, let's say, having a very aggressive marketing of the product, or by providing training to the farmers. That could be one option, and providing a price subsidy. Another option would be maybe by interlinking the weather index insurance with a credit, and maybe opting for alternative option using risk mitigating crops and technology. Just let me show you some of the findings, and I'll conclude my talk. If this could maybe realistically could improve the demand, the low take-up of this product. So generally, there is a lot of number of experiments by variation of the training, marketing, product design, but there is much more a modest impact on the take-up. So there's relatively low take-up with either video or flyer marketing of the product. And also they try to do also literacy training to improve their understanding about the product. The financial literacy, in fact, increased the take-up, but the problem is that it's not cost-effective. It is much more expensive to train these farmers about the insurance product. So from an economic point of view, that is not cost-effective. Another option they try to do is also through trust and experiential learning by using key institutions to endorse the program or key figures to endorse the program. That's kind of makes it. In some region, it improved the take-up, and in some region, it did not. But one thing that did increase the take-up is observing payouts. Families who have experience of receiving the insurance payout last year, they tend to purchase the insurance this year. Either what we call this past dependency, or they call this recency bias. That's also an interesting thing, right? So that's another story. Another key story that also in the countries where there is group risk sharing is strong, the take-up tend to be much more higher. I think they observed this in Ethiopia and some region and India. In Ethiopia, for instance, there is a culture of risk sharing, right? That they help each other and so on. So the explanation for this is that when there is a group risk sharing, that could partially cover what I call this basis risk, right? So that risk sharing arrangement might help in terms of addressing risk associated with crop failure due to pest and disease or other issues that could explain. So it's kind of a mixed story in terms of training, marketing, and product. The second is about the subsidy, right? The subsidy, how good is subsidy? How much can we subsidize this product to increase the take-up, right? So normally in the health sector, in terms of like promoting anti-malaria beds and fertilizer use, there's some evidence that a lot of temporary subsidy can have a durable effect on the demand, on the use of those products across time, right? But in the case of weather index insurance, there are some dynamic effects, but that is only limited to the products that was paid for. It's not like widespread. And there are some studies also to try to kind of understand what would be the optimal subsidy that one could provide to reach into a certain threshold of take-up demand. But generally, there is no evidence that temporary subsidy will kickstart a private market and make unnecessary thereafter, right? One of the thinking about this smart subsidy is you provide a subsidy temporarily, and that would help the private market to kind of take off, and then it would withdraw the subsidy after certain years. For weather index insurance, we have not seen evidence so far. So the question is then, can you make a welfare case to have a perpetual subsidy to weather index insurance? That's a very big question. Without the subsidy, weather index insurance will not be. So an alternative that they start to experiment, there are not many evidence on this, but that could be an option, linking weather index insurance with credit, combining those two products together, right? So that could help in terms of, alleviating risk rationing and bring more individuals to credits, and it could have also a supply side effect, right? Crowding in more credits into the market where the credit supply is limited. So, the problem with this, as you can imagine, is also repayment of those credits. A problem in many of these countries. Again, there is a lot need to be piloted on this, linking those together. That could be, I suppose, some of the future. And the second one is risk mitigating crop and technology. And there's limited also evidence on this in terms of having there are a lot of research, I know. I've been also working on this area, but in a much more rigorous way in terms of randomizing and so on. There are limited evidence. But there is a potential for that also. Sustainable agricultural practice, drought-tolerant varieties, flood-tolerant varieties, helping families, household to manage this. So generally, this is my last slide. Risk matter for smallholder farmers, but as I noted, the demand is very low. At the market price, demand is very low. There's limited trust. Financial literacy is a problem. And then there's the issue of basic risk. And then we need to rethink insurance going forward. And one option would be, instead of providing a subsidy, you provide the insurance for free, instead of providing cash transfer, the first one I talked, right? So that's a free handout. That would be an option. And instead of providing the insurance for household, one could think about providing also for lenders, agricultural lenders. So you insure the institution instead of the household. And then we need to further pilot linking insurance with credit. And then the risk mitigating crops would be another. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Saul. That was great. I'm going to use the moderator's privilege for a couple of questions, if that's okay, and then I'm going to open it up. It was interesting to me on the first presentation that you made on cash transfers, and you came out with a few things. Just to summarize that, yes, the impact of cash transfers can be seen, but they're especially relevant for climate shocks. They especially have impacts for when they are pro-poor, and they lead to local multiplier effects, and they have positive spillovers. But it's really linked to predictability, that you should have regular and predictable cash transfers. If you have 20% of cash transfers, then that's a good amount. And then it's also dependent on what the demographic is of the area for cash transfers to be impactful. So my question there is, what was the period of time over which you were looking at for the effect of cash transfers? And what was the administrative cost? Because as we know, cash transfers can be conditional and unconditional. And so what was the administrative cost also of making sure that the conditions of cash transfers were being fulfilled? And then my last question on that is, you did see an impact on savings, but did that translate into an impact on incomes? Yeah. So that's on cash transfers. And on weather insurance, again, something actually quite close to my heart, because my co-authors and I have worked in this area, and we found exactly like your work has, that weather insurances historically had very low levels of uptake. We did a systematic review, and we found 50 studies that were relevant, and 30% was really a very, very high level of uptake. So most studies did not see, high uptake, exactly like what you saw. And that petered down depending on the length of time that you investigated weather insurance for. So I was wondering again, for weather insurance, how long you had looked at repurchase of weather insurance and over what periods of time. And we found, for example, that 6 to 8 years was the minimum amount of time that you wanted to look at weather insurance if you wanted to understand uptake. But again, also if you saw impacts of weather insurance on production behavior or not. I'm going to stop there. I don't know if you wanted to respond, but should we take a few questions as well? Yeah. So with that, I'm going to open it up also to the audience. Don't be shy. Yes, okay, go for it.
Thank you, Solomon. So I understood the differences between, you make the comparison between African countries and Latin American countries and the benefit of cash transfer, but it was unclear to me why is it in Africa countries that they use more the cash transfer mitigation tool? And is there a reason because it's more suitable for them, or is it just because it's a choice of policymakers? So that's my question. And just a second question, which is a quick one, is what's the difference between nominal multiplier and the real multiplier?
Okay, so the differences in country types and nominal and real multipliers. Anyone else? Yes, please. And if you could introduce yourself.
Jeremiah from GSH.
Oh, yes.
I think my mind is trying to digest a lot of information. But is the paper for public consumption? Can I have it for cash transfer? I think maybe it can answer most of the questions. Then the second one is about, I think it goes in line with what Joe said, the economic conditions for the countries, the period. Can it not be another factor to consider? I couldn't pick how it affected the outcomes. Thank you.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me start responding to some of Joe's questions. In terms of, for the cash transfer program impact the lifespan, when did we look at the program? So for the different countries, it varies depending on the program implementation. There are some countries where we looked at 1 year after the program started, 2 years after the program started, and 4 years after the program started, right? So it matters a lot, like Joe noted, because some of the outcome variables, we may not observe impacts unless a given amount of time is passed. So for instance, for some of input use indicators, we could observe whether they use the money to increase consumption and fertilizer and so on and so on. But if that would translate into higher income, maybe a given amount of time need to be passed. So I cannot say exclusively this year, but we look at different years. But another interesting story, I just came from Addis, and I met an old colleague of mine who work on this area, and they looked at some of the impact of this program after the program stopped. Right? They stopped the program, whether the impact we observed. I showed, for instance, for Gambia, the impact is stronger, right? Did the impact sustain once the program stopped? And he told me that it disappeared. So, which not, that's a bigger question. So, when the program stops, and then what they observed, the positive impact already disappeared. So, the question is whether that is even sustainable in the long term. That's a bigger issue, generally. But the year varies. The second aspect about conditional versus unconditional, I do not discuss about this, is that's one of the difference between Latin America case and the African. In the African case, most of the programs are unconditional. So there's no condition attached to the program. Latin America case, they would say, we provide cash transfer, but then condition on that, you would send your kids to school, or you would send your kids to health. If you don't do that, you would then not receive the cash transfer. But in most of African case, there's no condition attached. There are some nudging or some soft messaging, encouraging household to spend the money in a certain way, but there's no condition. And the reason is that because if you force households to send your kid to school, and if there's no school nearby, and then you can't penalize those households because of what we call this supply shortage in services, healthcare, and so on. I think that's there's some conditional cash transfer, especially promoted by World Bank, but for the most part, it's unconditional. Right. So with respect to whether that's insurance job, maybe I can't really answer if they have looked at the number of years in terms of estimating the impact, but I could imagine also that also matters. Like you said, maybe you want me to look at 6 years, 8 years to really understand whether the take-up will persist. But I don't have that information, how many years they have looked at that. With respect to Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, you said basically cash transfer is predominantly implemented in Latin America before it came to African countries. The Mexico, Progresa one is the famous one, and Brazil, Nicaragua. So that's where it started mostly. There's a lot of student cash transfer program in Latin America, and then after proliferation in African countries nowadays. Nominal versus real multiplier is the real multiplier reflects a constraint within the household. It's kind of a modeling that you try to, when you do the estimation, like we call a nominal exchange rate versus exchange rate with purchasing power parity and so on. So it will reflect a constraint within the household, right? When there is no constraint, like I said, in terms of increasing production services, that's the nominal, right? But if there is a constraint, you bring that into the estimation, you could compute the real one that will take into account the constraint. And the paper questions are ready. If you ask me, there's a number of paper I could share with you.
Thank you.
Answer another question.
You had
The
another
last one
question?
is about the general economic condition for the countries, because I was thinking there might be, like for example, if you do a cash transfer like program right now in Zimbabwe, I think it will yield nothing because of the economic conditions. So I was just trying to broaden to think like, what are the conditions? Will it be conducive? Maybe inflationary, something like just thinking. Yeah.
I think I agree with you. The economic, it does matter, and how like I said, you provide a cash transfer into a local economy or a household. If there is no increase in supply response, if the funds will not expand production, for instance, if they are not good and service expanded there, if the supply did not increase, then that additional injection of cash would lead to inflation, increase in commodity. So it does matter. I agree with you.
Okay. Yeah, go for it.
My question is on the demographics that you have indicated. I think you said the returns for poorer households is better. They tend to get more returns out of the investment, but is there a difference between the kinds of households? Like in the Ethiopian case, you would have polygamous households which have extended families, or you have female heads of households. So I don't know if the returns would be seen in agriculture per se, because their investment is towards social related investments. So has the study looked at those kinds of investment returns on investments, and whether that is counted as something positive? I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you
if
very
you could
much.
introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Ishaq Mohammed from DMS.
And Mike, because we are recording this so that.
Okay. My name is Ishaq Mohammed from DMS. Thank you very much for the presentation, Solomon. I very much liked it when you presented on the livelihood empowerment against poverty in Ghana. And I was so attracted to the slide that actually compared the population pyramid of Ghana versus another country. And in the case of Ghana, I noticed that Ghana had a had a shrinking active population. So I was wondering, with the livelihood, what my understanding of the LEAP program is that it's actually being implemented across the nation. But when you look at the 3 northern regions in Ghana, you realize that they are the most vulnerable when it comes to agricultural risk. And because of that, you see a lot of the active population migrating to the southern regions. So my question is, did you look at the northern regions, or you looked at all the regions in Ghana? If it's the northern region, then I can understand that it's probably because of the high influx of the active population to the southern region. That is why the population pyramid is showing that we have less active population. Is that the case, or you actually looked at the entire country?
Thanks, Ishaq. One more question, and then we'll have Andrea, and then, 2 more. So 1 question per person.
Okay, so my name is Andrea Guevara. I am an intern with IRM, and thank you for your presentation first. And I think we saw a lot of positive effects, and I am with my question links with the prior question. So in the negative effects, I keep on seeing that probably a high risk, a social risk, could be related with the income that a family can receive and how the administration and how.
Just come up to the mic, Andrea. Sorry.
Thank you. So how the administration of that money could lead to gender risk, like for example, violence in a family, because in the case that I have some examples in Latin America and from Ecuador, so I've seen this happening, that when a family, poor family is receiving money, there's a lot of alcohol-related problems. So there's a lot of violence in the family and prostitution as well. So there's a lot of health issues regarding this. So I want to hear if you have some examples about this, and if you can talk a little bit about the negative effects that this could have. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks, Solomon, for the very interesting presentation. I had 2 questions, but one was, my name is Miwa Kato. I'm in DCP. I'm secondary from UNFCCC Secretariat. I had 2 questions, and one was, one overlaps with what Sakira asked about whether the intervention, whether you had any thoughts about the intervention was done at the right level, whether the household or the individual level is comparable, or is the right level comparing to doing so at the sovereign risk management level, such as Africa risk capacity that Sakira mentions, that whether the cost effectiveness should actually be comparable at that level. But my another question was around sustainability of both these cash transfer initiatives and weather index initiatives. As you mentioned, for the cash transfer initiatives, yes, it's proven effective to mitigate climate risks. But then the examples that you had was mostly around extreme weather events. And then the unique characteristics, or the characteristic of climate risk is the long-term issue. And whether you had any thoughts on the sustainability of such cash transfer for longer-term effects, such as sea level rise or the desertification or salinization, which it's not a one-time intervention. That for the cash transfer, and then question. Right, the weather unit. Well, I should stop.
We have 1 question. Well, that's good. Let's stop here, and so you have a lot of questions.
That's a lot of questions. So Sadlet's question on
on gender polygamous. I think we have not looked at the polygamous concept that much in most of the countries, but we do have a lot of information on gender disaggregated effects. And most, I've not presented here, but most of the indicator we use in terms of the effect of cash transfer, we try to look at the overall effect and then disaggregate it across male-headed household, female-headed household, at least to that extent, not within the composition of gender, but we did a lot of that distribution of effect, and I'm happy to share with you if you are interested. With respect to LEAD program in Ghana, the demographic profile, I think maybe you kind of a little bit misunderstood what I presented. That doesn't reflect the demographic of Ghana. That reflects the demographic of the beneficiaries of the LEAD program. So that's what I try to make. The beneficiaries of LEAD program in Ghana is mostly household with elderly or more children in the household, less everybody. That's what I try to point. So the net intended effect, right? That's also the last question about using cash transfer for alcohol and other stuff. I think that's a myth, I would say. There might be some anecdotal evidence that the cash transfer might lead to families drinking alcohol, and that's one of the arguments against cash transfer in most countries. And in African countries, there is no evidence of that. And they might be here and there, right, in a pocket, but it's not like systemic, pervasive kind of most family using the cash they provided for alcohol or, like you said, prostitution and so on. And there's a paper even done by Ashu and colleagues. This is what they call debunking the myths about cash transfer. One of the myths was that cash transfer is used for alcohol, and there's no evidence in Africa. Another issue is also maybe what you mentioned about cash transfer program makes people lazy, right? There's okay. Let me rephrase. Your point is about reducing the adaptive capacity of household because of cash transfer program. But there is also related to that people work less. They get lazy, they don't work. And we do not find that evidence. Sometimes it is true that there is a reduction in labor force, but that's often substituted with working on farm. They tend to spend more time on their own farm instead of going working at the casual labor. There is a substitution of labor effect, but not them not working at all. And as with respect to whether it will reduce adaptive capacity of, I don't know if there is evidence of that. People would talk about as anecdotal, but I wouldn't buy to such kind of reasoning in a way. It could be anecdotal, but I would like to see hard evidence to that. There's a very good rigorous study that is done on Mozambique or in Botswana or in those regions that could prove there is reducing adaptive capacity with respect to that. I think my take is that there is a potential in such kind of program to use, like, and I know in the case of Paraguay, for instance, GCF invest in this conditional cash transfer to upgrade afforestation and so on. I think there is a potential to use social protection instrument like cash transfer for climate change adaptation, managing risk. The question is, how do we design the program? It's not any cash transfer program would lead to building adaptive capacity, but the way it's designed is matters. What kind of families would receive those cash transfer programs? And lastly, the program alone will not achieve the result. It is one instrument within the toolbox. They need to be what we call cash transfer plus. There need to be additional intervention, building capacity, like the BRAC program they use in Bangladesh, for instance, building graduation model, right? You provide cash and then the next year you provide training, you link them with credit, you link the same family with the market, and those complementary intervention would help them build the totality resilience and help them to move out of poverty. I think let me stop it there. Unless I miss any other
question. Did you get Miwa's question about the Africa-wide?
Yeah. I don't have that much information about that index insurance for African-wide, because the example I noted are only for countries, Ethiopia, Ghana, India, for countries, so I have not looked at that. Also you mentioned about the issue about sustainability in the long term, whether cash transfer could help in terms of helping. I think it's one instrument, like I said, right? In the long term, cash transfer is one aspect, but you need to help in terms of building their capacity and early warning information is very important to deal with the risk and linking them to the markets and value chain concepts. So those all are very important. I'm not by any way implying that cash transfer program is a panacea to building their capacity and to risk be it either extreme shocks or a normal volatility of rainfall or temperature over the years. So I think that's the key message. So it needs to be a part of the broader rural development strategy when we deal with climate shocks.
And sorry, so let's question about polygamous households.
We have not looked at that. Yeah, we have not. I don't have any information.
The social returns as opposed to agricultural returns or income. I mean, expenditures by women would be more on social, children going to school, health, investments, and things like that. Cash transfers could be a way out for those kinds of things rather than just focusing on agricultural returns.
Yeah, you are absolutely right. The primary reason, even most of African countries, because of that objective, there is a social objective why they provide cash to help. Especially some of the beneficiaries are female aided. They use the money to send their kids to school, health service, and so on, many other social objectives. I did not show the result because I try to focus on the productive aspect of that, but there is a lot of evidence on that also, sending their kids to school, school attendance, and so on and so on.
Last two questions. I know Lalanath asked for the mic.
Mine was answered.
Okay, yours was answered. So last two questions. One, I hear.
Yeah, on the Africa risk, Mohammed from OED. So on the Africa risk capacity, I think what Solomon has presented for the individual, weather-based index applies for the ARC as well, because the ARC, out of these 54 African countries, only 8 have subscribed to this ARC. And one of the issues they have faced last time is when they pay out for Malawi drought, they only paid $8 million. And the drought has impacted almost 7 million population in Malawi. So if you consider, this payout compared to the impact of the drought, there is obviously an issue of the demand and also the amount. But Solomon, I have one question. You mentioned the predictability of the cash transfer, but I assume that before paying the cash, there is a trigger, right? There is no, contingency plan or anything like this they have to follow before that?
That's what I meant by unconditional. It's unconditional. They receive the cash monthly or by monthly. So there's no condition attached to that. The amount of the transfer they receive could be dependent on the household size, or it could be a flat transfer. Those households with more family members might receive more. In some countries, like in Zambia, that was the case, but in some countries, regardless of the family size, you receive monthly this amount of size. The unpredictability is because of the implementation. There is a problem with implementing the program, that they could not provide the cash transfer. That's why.
Okay.
Yeah, so cash transfers, that's the big problem. It's you get it every month. Just it should be predictable. And the difference between Zambia and Ghana came about because in Ghana, even though they had announced it, but there was a lack of fidelity in terms of how the program was implemented. But you get it every month. The look of disbelief on your face tells me that cash transfers, they're a new concept.
It's very limited,
Solomon
right?
laid out, as to why they were looked at suspiciously, started with the Progresa program in Mexico, where they actually said, well, we are going to give you $10 to $12 every month for all of the vulnerable households. And the questions were, are you going to spend it on alcohol, drugs? What will you do? Targeting is a really big question there.
Yeah. Can I ask a final question? So I don't mean to be a bit provocative here.
No, please be provocative.
Some people are saying that maybe, and this relates to what you said in terms of subsidy. Do we need subsidy for the weather index-based insurance to be more effective? And what do you think about the people saying that climate finance should be one of way to put subsidy money at the beginning, at least to make it more efficient or maybe effective for countries?
I'd like Jenny to answer this kind of it's not because we have the money we should spend on those programs, right? The question about even climate finance, they need to be sustainable. Then after when the program stops, would they sustain that? Then after the demand would stay? There's no evidence of that. Temporary subsidy could provide subsidy temporarily, but then in the long term, would that be viable? I think that would be an option to use to test some of these piloting linking with the credit in different countries. Maybe Joe and Jenny, if you'd like to comment on that.
Maybe just quickly.
Jenny,
yeah.
okay.
Okay, just quickly. No, thank you for Solomon for the presentation. But on this, I think what we have now in the portfolio and pipeline, we have more like mitigating the risk. No, so that's most of the investments. But we have few projects that are also having transfer elements and coping elements. But I'm also now very interested in the evidence, because the weather index insurance, the projects usually that we finance are quite short. So they say that, okay, first year is provided for free, or 2 years, so that they can see the benefits, and then, hoping that then the third year is 50% maybe subsidized, and then by the end of the project should be 100%. So that's a bit, I'm interested in looking more into that. But we have also some projects that have a conditional cash transfer element that is to build the climate resilient assets, because some communities are very vulnerable. How can they even put some of their time to do that while they're facing food insecurity, all that? So they receive a cash transfer, but for building those climate resilient assets at community level. And otherwise, we have a couple of project design that it's those that are being trained and adopting the resilient practices would receive some fertilizer, so it's like that the government subsidy would be associated, or access to credit, those kind of. But I think it seems the design is very important for sustainability and paradigm shift. So thank you.
And just in response from me, mostly cash transfer programs have been seen as a form of investment, especially, in terms of building not just physical infrastructure, but also social infrastructure. And so the returns are for the future. So if you look at them like that, then they're no longer just about getting past immediate climate shocks, but building resilience for the long term. And that's why it's really important to look at how long the impacts last. And so some of the evidence coming out from Africa shows that it doesn't, but in Latin America and Central America, so both are familiar, in Argentina and in Brazil, all of these have shown longer term impacts. But interestingly, almost all cash transfer programs in Latin America and South America now have impact evaluations associated with it. The governments do have to figure out whether implementation is going according to plan and the impacts that they're having on long-term sustainability of the impacts, not so much of the finances themselves. So these are important things, but they clearly have policy implications for GCF as well. Climate finance, how long should we subsidize and how long should we have these programs out for? Some of the work that we looked at when we looked at the evidence of weather insurance is this basis risk problem. Trustworthiness of how the payouts will occur definitely affects as to whether people adopt these or not. So, behavioral science and how that can play a role, that's a big area of exciting work that can and should be done in this space. So, Jamie, please look at it. Okay, with that, thank you so much, Solomon. That was really exciting. And just for your information, 30th of November, we'll have Yuha come and talk to us about the most recent performance review of the judge.